All right. Maybe I will give a minute or so for it to begin, for everyone to log in. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Panelists, I don't really have a good gather on how to know if people are here. Please let me know when you think I should begin with the welcome. I should go? Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. I am Michaela Holmes-Fuller, the postgraduate coordinator at Peak to Peak Charter School. On behalf of the Rocky Mountain College Night Planning Committee and the college counseling teams at Aspen High School, Colorado Academy, Dawson School, Fountain Valley School, Kent Denver School, Peak to Peak Charter School, and the Colorado Springs School, I want to welcome you to the panel Behind the Scenes, a look inside the application review process. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Michaela Knipp from Trinity University, Gary Ross from Colgate University, Kathleen Abels from Haverford College, and Rayanne Mena from St. Louis University, who will offer their expertise on this topic. Please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A section. This and all sessions from tonight will be recorded. Our session will end at 6:40 p.m. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Rayanne, who will serve as our moderator today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michaela, and thank you for having us as guests at this program. We are so excited to be here with you tonight for the next little bit and get some of your questions answered about the college admissions process, what to expect. We have got such great experience on this panel, so we hope you will utilize the Q&A. You can ask your questions there. We will attempt to answer as many of them as we can live, and certainly get you some responses typing out in chat if need be. So with that, since you know a little bit about who we are and what schools we're from, we thought we'd start the conversation with getting you familiar with our schools and something fun and quick before we dive into the heavy topics. So our first question for the panel is going to be, what is one unique tradition at your college or university that you want students to know about? And I can go ahead and start with that. So at St. Louis University, our mascot is the Billiken. He is a unique mascot. I should have brought a picture of him to hold up, although those never show up well on Zoom. But anyway, he is a mythical creature. He kind of, some people are like, is that what the Blue Devil at Duke looks like? Or, what is this exactly? But we have a tradition on campus. We have a Billiken statue, kind of looks like a little Buddha. And students go by and rub his belly before an exam for good luck. So the Billiken is unique. And then that tradition is kind of a fun way to kick it off. So Gary, do you mind going next and sharing something fun or unique?
I'd be delighted to. And Colgate was founded by 13 founders with $13 and 13 prayers. So we are fixated with the number 13. Our address is 13 Oak Drive. Our zip code, which of course we couldn't control, happens to be 13 and then 346. What does 3, 4, and 6 add up to? All the students on this call are very smart and they've already figured out 13. And then the last thing is on your diploma will be our Latin motto, Deo ac Veritate. And how many letters do you think are in that Latin motto, which stands for in English, God and truth, or God and truth? There are 13 letters in that motto. So we are fixated with the number 13.
Ah, fascinating. I'm learning a lot already. Great. Michaela, do you mind going next with Trinity?
At Trinity, we're pretty fixated on food. A lot of our traditions are food related. I think one of my favorites is around finals every year. We have a midnight breakfast. So we know students are up late studying for exams. And so in our main dining hall, we actually serve breakfast at midnight, and students will line up in their pajamas and come and grab bacon and French toast served by faculty and staff at Trinity. So you might have the dean of students giving you some pancakes at midnight, which is great, just to give you a little bit more fuel as you're studying for your finals. So yeah, midnight breakfast is one of my favorite traditions.
Awesome, thank you. Kathleen, you want to wrap us up on this question?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked this question because I have the perfect Zoom background. So At Haverford, every student completes a senior thesis. And then once that deadline passes, the entire senior class sort of joins together on one of our greens and comes in to this building called Founders Hall. At the top, there's a bell tower, and students have the opportunity to sign their name. And you see literally thousands and thousands of other names of Haverford alums who have signed before you. And then every student rings the bell, and it's sort of the celebration of what you've accomplished, but also the ways in which you've shaped and changed the community that you've been a part of. So yeah, thanks for kicking us off with this great question.
Yeah, no problem. I know we'll probably dive into some deeper topics today. So definitely wanted to start with something fun. And I think what we're going to do is direct a question to each panelist. So some of us may chime in after they answer with some other thoughts that we have. But we'll go ahead and give Gary the first question. Gary, if you had to think about what has changed this last year, maybe the last a year and a half, 2 years, but focusing on this last year, what has changed in this last year, and how will that influence this next admission cycle, do you think?
I think for many of us, I'll just speak for myself, but I bet my colleagues on the panel would feel the same way. And in fact, I bet colleagues at many other colleges and universities would feel the same way. So many of us got into college and university admissions because we enjoy being around people, mostly young people who are at a very exciting point in their lives, and having them have the opportunity to explore what it is that we offer at our own particular colleges and universities, have them get a feel or sense for the campus when they're in a position to visit that college or university. And almost without warning, all of that changed a little bit over a year ago to the day. And many of us had to pivot very quickly to try and still convey that excitement and to try and convey the many opportunities that our campuses offer. But we had to do that now virtually. And I think some colleges and universities adjusted very quickly and did an outstanding job. And then I've heard from some other colleges and universities that it took them a while. That they had some struggles. But what I think I can say on behalf of all of us in college and university admission is when we were in a position, and some of us still are, we are not, but some of us still are in a position where you can't have visitors come to the campus. We miss that immensely. It was a very happy day on our campus when we were able to reopen the campus to visitors. And I, for one, would never, ever, change is good, but I would never, ever want to experience the change where we can't have prospective students and their families being able to come to our campus to see if it might be a potential match for them.
Oh, and I think you summed it up perfectly for so many of us. I see Michaela and Kathleen kind of nodding their heads. So thank you for putting that out there for us. Michaela, I'm going to ask you the next question, and just thinking about where our attendees are in the process and kind of, really getting going into their college search and then the application process. What advice do you have on how a student should communicate with admissions offices? I think, we've got so many mediums that we use nowadays, and just looking for some expert advice here on communicating with admissions offices.
Absolutely. And there are many ways you can be communicating with admissions offices. We've gotten really savvy. There are even, texting systems that we can utilize now. I personally think, and my colleagues can agree or disagree with me here, that email is still one of probably the best ways to be communicating with the admissions offices. You're probably signing up for mailing lists now and starting to get quite a few emails. We try our best not to overwhelm you, but we do want to provide you with a lot of information as you are exploring different universities and colleges. And email remains probably one of the best ways to stay in communication with us. Now, that being said, you'll notice there's faces on this screen. In the admissions office, there are humans, there are real people to talk to. So you can always pick up the phone and call an office if you'd rather have an in-depth conversation. Zoom chats are a way to communicate as well. And even like I said, texting platforms are a possibility. I do want to provide some caution when it comes to texting. If an admissions counselor does provide you with their cell phone number, I always like to instill some boundaries there. If you text at 10 o'clock at night or on a weekend, you might not get a response until a weekday during 8 to 5 hours. But if that is a method of communication with an admissions office, they'll definitely let you know. So my gut says email is the best way, but there are several other paths that you can go down to stay in communication with universities.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much. We're starting to get some questions in the Q&A, and so this is working out well. Kathleen, I'm going to direct the next question to you. Can you give maybe an example or two, or just talk generally about specific ways students have stood out in the admissions process, and maybe while naming, a way or two that they've stood out in the admissions process, what don't you want to see, as an admissions counselor? And we might all have a story or two to jump in with here, but if you could get us started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for those questions that are coming through in the Q&A. I think one of the real joys in reading an application is seeing how each component better informs our sense of who you are, the ways in which you engage in communities, what matters to you, and your hopes for who you'll be in the future. And so I think the sort of biggest misstep that students take is feeling like they have to write about something in their essay, or they have to get that teacher to write their letter of recommendation for them. And really, this is a process that students succeed when they allow for self-reflection. So take time to think about, what do you want to share with us? What are your hopes for the future? How do you think different colleges and universities will support you in that? And those sort of self-reflections, I think, allow for really compelling applications. Applications stand out because they sound like you, right? I've worked in admission for 11 years. I've read 11,000 plus personal essays, and I haven't read one from anyone on this call. Right. And so the idea is not to stand out because you picked a topic that I've never read before. If 11,000 people didn't pick a topic, maybe there's a reason to stay away from that, right? But the way you think about a specific idea or issue shares more about who you are and what you value. And ultimately, those are the questions we're asking when we're reading your application. So be yourself. That sort of authenticity and clear voice is what is most exciting and what makes this process such a privilege to be a part of from our perspective too.
Awesome, thank you. And that is kind of the perfect segue into a question that I might tackle here, and then see if you all have any input as well. One of the questions we got kind of in advance was, what topics should be avoided in essays? And obviously, Kathleen, you kind of brought us there too a little bit, because I think sometimes, you can write about or talk about anything. It's often in the way it's presented, about your interest and your voice and your passion. That's so important. But, oftentimes we get the question of, what topics should be avoided, and nothing necessarily has to be avoided if it's done well. But I will just chime in with some of the more popular essay topics that I think we see over and over. And so if you're thinking about going this route, just know to take it to a level. One that I see quite often is the essay on the athletic injury, right? And that's not to say that is not a topic you can't write about, but very often the athletic injury essay is just this transformative, like, it was Friday night, the stadium lights were on, the ball came to me, the ball went left, my knee went right. Next thing you know, I was on the ground and the trainer was standing over me, and then the ambulance came and my parents met me at the hospital. And before you know it, the student has spent 650 words getting us to, the hospital and the recovery. And it's so descriptive and it's well written, but the problem is we never learn, how did they grow when they couldn't play their favorite sport? Did they try to start writing for the school newspaper and discover their love of journalism? Or did they, we missed that opportunity to say, this was a challenge in my life, and this is how I overcame it. This is how I worked around it. This is what I learned about myself. And so there's no topic that is off limits or that shouldn't be written about it, but it's almost remembering that more popular topics like athletic injuries, community service projects, those types of things are more popular. And so it's really about your personal experience and how it affected you, would be how I would kind of just chime in about, what topics should be avoided. But does anyone have any strong opinions about what topics should be avoided in essays, things we've seen over the years? I've seen people do, really difficult essays well. So Gary, you unmuted. Does that mean?
Man, I have never read a good one, and I read probably 150 or 200 a year, where the topic is the challenge associated with picking a topic on writing the college application essay. I've never read a good one. And so I'm not actually issuing a challenge to our listeners tonight to try and figure out a way to write an essay like that that could be good. Instead, my best suggestion is you try and avoid it.
Really good perspective. Kayla, you got anything? Yeah.
It's not so much a topic, it's more just something that I've seen in essays. It's a little bit of a pet peeve. I sometimes see or read essays where students are talking about how much they love a specific university because they wrote their essay about a specific university, and that university was not my university, and they sent the same essay to all the schools they're applying for. And that in no way like docks my thought on the student or impacts the decision in any way, shape, or form. But sometimes I'll be reading an essay and they're like, I really love this school, small school, great spirit. I'm like, wow. And it's a totally different university's name in there. So just a word of caution, if you are writing a university specific essay, to make sure to change that when you are submitting your essay to other institutions.
Perfect. Kathleen, I know you kind of addressed it in the earlier question too, but anything you want to chime in about essay topics at all, or?
I read a shocking number of students who write essays about things that happen in a bathroom, and I would say that's generally something that's good to avoid as well. Don't know who you are. I'm not easily offended, but there might be other people reading that essay who would be. So that would be my word of wisdom.
Right. And sometimes where you just see where it's taking place, you're like, where is this going to go? What is happening here? So yes, I agree. That's definitely a safe bet. Awesome. Well, good. Well, thank you guys for that. And we've got some great questions coming in. Gary, can you talk a little bit about, we got a question of how does an admissions committee actually decide who gets in? And I know this could be one of those it depends questions, but any, kind of thoughts on how you want to answer that in the most simple way possible?
Yeah, it is a shame that all of us are not with you tonight in beautiful Colorado to do the case studies program that probably all of us have had the privilege of doing in person before at your terrific schools. Because one of the things that we would be taking you through in that program is the importance of knowing the institution that you represent and what some of the values, what some of the priorities are for that institution. And then also evaluating the context of where it is that you are a high school student. In our office, and I suspect, I hope all others, we believe all people are created equally, but we don't believe all transcripts are created equally. And in fact, all high schools are not created equally. Not all high schools offer the same types of opportunities in coursework. Not all high schools have the same types of facilities as each other. So there are many differences in high schools. And so what we do is we look at what a student has presented to us. The most important factor is always the academic record, the level of challenge that you've embraced as a student based upon what was available to you. And of course, how you did in those courses that you elected to pursue. But for many of us, particularly, I suspect those of us who are on the call tonight, we care a whole lot about your recommendations. What kind of person are you going to be? How are you going to impact our campus? And so the committee will discuss those recommendations after it's carefully reviewed your academic record. And then we're going to look and talk about the impact that you might have on our campus. And that could be based upon that essay that we just finished discussing briefly. That could be based upon some activities that you may have had the time to pursue. That could be based upon maybe something that a recommender said about you that we wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to know. And typically that's something that's very good about an applicant that maybe that applicant was just too modest to tell us about. So we look at those factors, and then we always have to remember the institution that we are representing. And it may be that you would be an outstanding electromagnetic engineer, and that all of your recommendations confirm that. But if you're applying to a college or a university that doesn't offer one course in electromagnetic engineering, then you may not be the best fit. It's not because there's something wrong with you. We are looking for applicants who are going to be a great fit. And it's a great fit on the part of what you're looking for, and a great fit on the part of what the institution is looking for.
That's great. Thank you very much. And you may not have even noted, but you were answering another question that in the chat while you were answering that question. So it was perfect. So thanks for covering that in such a broad way to help. Michaela, next question is for you. We've gotten a couple questions on this, and it has to do with test optional. As we know, big topic this year. Many of us on here were test optional before, but if not, some of us are now and will be staying that way. So the questions really have to do with, with so many schools going test optional, how does a student stand out, and what really sets an applicant apart when you don't have test scores to look at? Obviously, it's been touched on in other answers, but Michaela, if you want to help us get started on that one.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of what Gary was just talking about, I think hits on those other ways that students can stand out without test scores. I think most colleges, especially the colleges on this call here, were never only looking at test scores. And in fact, it was only one aspect of the application review at any given point, right? It was never the end all be all of an application review. And that has not changed. That has not shifted. There are other components of an application that are incredibly important. I think Kathleen mentioned it's where we get to know you, right? Where we get to hear your voice in your essay, or through your letters of recommendation, or through your extracurricular involvement. Those other aspects of the application, we just get to hone in on a little bit more than we would have before. It might vary by institution, but I can speak for at Trinity. When students don't submit test scores, that is not a negative. That does not, we're not looking at that as, oh, you didn't submit test scores, so that's not it at all. It's just, okay, you didn't submit test scores, perfect. And we look at those other pieces, those other components of the application when we're making a decision. To be fully transparent, we do focus in a little bit more on the academic record. So transcript, looking at, Gary mentioned those courses that have been available to you, how you did in those courses, things like that, again, within the context of your specific high school. So we do kind of focus in on that. But honestly, we focused in on that more in past years as well. That was always such an important part of the application review, and that has not shifted. But there are other ways that you can stand out, right, through those other application components, but also look to see if schools offer other opportunities, potentially campus visits if schools are open, maybe virtual opportunities, maybe interviews if schools offer interviews. That's a great opportunity to be face-to-face with an admissions representative and share your story and put a face to a name. And that's great even if you are applying with test scores, I think, to be able to actually talk to your admissions counselor and share your story. So those other components of the application are incredibly important, and we're able to really focus in on those. And it's okay if students decide to apply without test scores. So hopefully that helps provide a bit more context.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Kathleen, I'm going to chime in with an answer here real quick to another, it's a similar thought pattern and question, and then we'll switch to a new topic for you. But so the question is, if a student isn't submitting test scores, how does a college decide who gets in? And just have some personal experience with this. At St. Louis University, I am the admissions liaison for our School of Nursing, and our School of Nursing was the one school that wanted to be the holdout this year and was like, we can't go test optional. We need that data. We could never admit everybody if we don't have that data. How would we ever do it? And so working with them as the liaison this year, we came up with a really amazing rubric so that, that we looked at everything academically, extracurricularly, assigned, the rubric had point values. And so it was the way it was read and the way it was scored, I was able to give them clear and concise data of particular areas, both academically and extracurricular, to give them score bands to know, okay, this score and up is who's going to get in. This, score is going to be the wait list, the denies. And so colleges are finding ways, to figure out who gets in without test scores, in a number of different ways. Some have been doing it particular ways for a long period of time. But what was amazing for our School of Nursing is that they were able to admit the students that should have been admitted and, probably would have been admitted with or without test scores. And so schools are finding, to put the question was out there, how are we deciding who gets in without this information? There are, like, as you've heard, in the last few answers, there are a lot of other pieces of information that we can get out there and a lot of ways that we can get creative with the data to give us some of the same information. So definitely feel free to keep asking questions about test optional, because I know there's a lot. Kathleen, I'm going to switch gears because another timely topic from the past year. There's a question about what information should be included in the application about the student's experience with the pandemic. We all know that the Common App in particular had a space where you could comment on it, and any thoughts, and maybe others have advice too after you tackle it first, Kathleen, but what's your advice there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think the first thing, and this is true for each piece of the application, is you should share what you're comfortable sharing. There are some people for whom they feel it's sort of, helpful to be able to share more about their family situation and the experiences that they've had as a result of the COVID pandemic. We know that students across the globe have been impacted by this, but it's impacted each of us differently. And so if you're able to share about your particular situation, then that is additional context. And I hope it's clear, right? Gary talked about the context of your high school. We think about many different lenses and many different sort of opportunities to understand context. And this is in some ways a shared context, living through a global pandemic, but also understanding that that has impacted each of us differently. There are some students who didn't answer that Common App question at all. And that doesn't mean that I don't think they were impacted by the pandemic, right? And there are other students who had really lengthy responses. So I hope you feel like you're able to share what you think allows us to better understand who you are. One other piece that I just want to highlight, and this isn't true just only for COVID, but I think oftentimes students think about extracurriculars in a really narrow way. And because of the sort of context of this global pandemic, right? You're probably helping out at home, maybe more than ever before. That's something that you should share with us. Do you take care of a younger sibling? Are you helping them more than ever get on their Zoom classes, right? That's a way that you're spending your time. Did you get a job because you were someone who was able to work in your family? That's a really important way that you've been contributing to community. And so that while that relates to COVID, also thinking about sort of other ways to give us a sense of how you've engaged, and not think about extracurriculars as like clubs and organizations only at your high school or only within your community. There are many other ways to give us a sense of who you are and how you're contributing.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much for that. Gary, I am going to direct the next question to you. And again, we're kind of jumping from topic to topic here, but how important would you say summer activities are in the admissions process?
Well, first of all, shout out to Kathleen for making such an important point, and it actually segues perfectly into this question that you just asked, Rayanne. I was talking with the student not all that long ago, actually on a Zoom call, and she stayed on at the end and asked me a question, and it went something like this. I'm really worried because the pandemic has pretty much eliminated the possibility that I could do anything at all in the way of activities that will impress colleges or universities that I'm applying to. How do you suspect I handle that? And so, because at that point she was the only one on the Zoom call, we talked a little bit, and it turns out that both of her parents are and were at the time considered to be essential workers. And so they were not at home, and she was home taking care of younger siblings, just exactly like the example that Kathleen pointed out. And that is hugely important. And so please don't think, because of the fact that you weren't able to meet every week in person with the members of the student council, or you weren't able to do a really cool activity that the club you're involved in has done every year up until the pandemic, and then they couldn't do it this past year. There are ways perhaps in which you've been serving your community or even serving your family that are very, very meaningful. And for people who are not in that situation, I've heard of other examples where students have become really passionate about theater. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, how could you become passionate about theater if you were confined to your home for 6 months? What are you going to go out in the backyard and call that theater? Not at all. There are many online programs where you can really immerse yourself in the world of theater or in the world of music or in other parts of the arts or in other areas of life that you may not have otherwise had the time to pursue if it were not for a pandemic. And so I'm aware of students that have really become students of the theater because of the fact that they had the time to download some of the opportunities through the internet that they otherwise wouldn't have had time to pursue. So don't hit the panic button. There may have been things that you were already doing that we'd be very much eager to hear about. And then the last point is, you're not alone. You're not alone. The pandemic is a worldwide pandemic. And it's not as if you were going to have to explain to those of us who are reading your application that there was this disease that came along. It was called COVID-19, and my school was closed, and I wasn't able to do much as a result. We get it. And so bear in mind, with so many of us, we're not looking for reasons to deny your admission. We're looking for reasons to admit you, and you want to do the same thing. And so if you were doing things that were constructive and meaningful, but maybe not traditional in the sense of what you might be doing in the four walls of your school with a club, tell us about it anyway.
So true. Thank you so much. And you're right, that was the perfect segue to your question. And now we've got the perfect segue to Michaela. Just one last question, it seems, about extracurriculars. If a student's extracurriculars are not directly related to the major they are looking at, do we still place the same amount of value on them when we're reviewing them? Do you mind answering that?
That's a great question. It is totally acceptable and celebrated if you are exploring activities or hobbies or passions outside of your main area of interest. I think that that's something that we value when we're reviewing applications, is to see that you are complex and that you do have many different passions and hobbies, and that's okay. And honestly, sometimes things that seem really unrelated, like a student who's fascinated with chemistry and loves baking. Okay, maybe that seems unrelated, but they're actually so much more related than you would ever think. There's value in all of the things that you've chosen to spend your time doing. There's a reason you spent your time doing it. There was something that you gathered from doing it. And so even if it's not directly related to the specific program that you're looking to study, that's okay for a lot of reasons. One being that you could change your mind, right? But also because it's okay to explore a lot of different interests. And we love seeing that students are well-rounded and complex beings. So definitely keep pursuing those hobbies outside of that, main area of interest.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. And so, Kathleen, we had a really cool question that I like, if we might all have a different answer for this one, but when you get an email from a student, as an admissions counselor, what kinds of questions are you unable to answer? So the question reads, what kinds of questions are you unable to answer when a student emails an admissions counselor? And I think sometimes, Gary mentioned it, if we were doing that case study, we would be talking about some of the things the university is looking for and, and thinking about some of those tough questions we get. What's a question that you haven't been able to answer for a student and had to say, I'll get back to you, or, yeah, I don't have that information?
Yeah, sure. There are a lot coming in right now about what the fall will look like, right? And I think we've all learned so much from this sort of shared experience of living through a global pandemic. And there are a lot of questions about: are you going to require vaccinations across students? Is every student going to have a single room on campus? And so. There are a lot of questions about sort of what's next and what the fall will look like, that we're working really hard to get answers to, and working with teams of experts to make sure we're keeping people safe. But that's certainly the one that came to mind most quickly when that student posed the question. I think one of the other questions is, oftentimes students will email if a decision didn't go their way, and they'll ask for why, right? Like, why wasn't I admitted? And that's a really hard question to answer too, because unfortunately, we're making really hard decisions, and those decisions are based in the context of our applicant pools, and there isn't usually an answer beyond the fact that we have many more wonderful students who apply than places in our class. And so those are sort of two of the themes of questions that I think often are harder to answer right now.
Perfect. Thank you for handling that one. And I do want to say we've got about 4 minutes left before Michaela's going to come back on and get us ready to move to our next session. So we are going to do our best to get through the rest of these questions kind of rapid fire, and I'll start typing some responses too. But Gary, the next question is going to be for you, and it's sort of a bigger question, so I apologize, but someone wanted to know how long we spend reading an application. And then someone also wanted to know a little bit of the difference between what an early decision review looks like versus regular decision review process. If you have any quick thoughts on those. I know those could be their own session, right? But yeah. Oh, you're muted, Gary.
Thank you. With
Yeah.
with 4 minutes left, it's going to be really hard to handle either one of those, but we'll give it our best shot. In terms of how long an application might take to read, that can vary. You'll always hear from admissions folks these two words quite a bit. It depends, and it does depend on the application itself, what is in the file, and the particular policies that an office might have in terms of how they read, what format they use to read, how much they use committee. Not every office uses the committee to evaluate every single application. If I were to give you a ballpark answer, I would say somewhere between 9 and 15 minutes per application. I would say, frankly, closer to the 9 or 10 minute mark than the 15-minute mark. That's not to say there won't be an application that will come and be discussed by an entire committee and wind up taking 20 or 30 minutes. That would be very, very, very rare, but it does happen. And there are applicants which are simply not even close to being competitive within all of our pools. And those applications will still get read, but it will be a very brief read just to make sure that, in fact, the data that we think we've seen from the application is in fact accurate. And once we've confirmed that, it really will be a brief read. I'd say 3 or 4 minutes if in fact the data reveals that it's a non-competitive application. In terms of early decision and regular decision, Rayanne, I'm going to punt on that one because there are so many different policies that different institutions have. Some people give preference to early decision applicants, some people do not. It's never wrong to ask a school whether or not they give preference to early decision applicants or not. You're well within your rights to ask that question. But in terms of how they might be evaluated differently, I really think that's one that should be more institution specific. And so I wouldn't want to chew up our valuable time by launching off into detail on that.
That is great. And you got us right to the 39 past the hour, which is when Michaela comes back on. So it was perfect timing. We are all kind of trying to get to your last couple questions here, typing out answers. So I'll toss it back to Michaela to wrap us up. And thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, panelists, for sharing your time and your expertise with us this evening. There is now going to be a quick 10-minute break before the second panel session. You can revisit the website at strivescan.com/CO2021 if you still need to choose a session. And also remember that that website is where the meeting room links for the student-only question and answer session for each individual college will be set up. That will be from 7:30 to 8. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Great job, Rayanne. Thank you. And thanks, Michaela.
Thanks, panelists. Great.